Welcome to my presentation on Gian Lorenzo Bernini. As we move on, we'll be looking at the biography and the work done by the wonderful sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini. 1. His early years. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, born in December 7th, 1598, Naples, in the Kingdom of Naples, Italy. An Italian artist who was perhaps the greatest sculptor of the 17th century and an outstanding architect as well. Bernini created the Baroque style of sculpture and developed it to such an extent that other artists are only minor importance in a discussion of that style. In the early years, Bernini's career began under his father, Pietro Bernini, a Florentine sculptor of some talent who ultimately moved to Rome. The young prodigy worked so diligently that he earned the praise of the painter Annibale Carracci and the patronage of Pope Paul V, and soon established himself as a wholly independent sculptor. He was strongly influenced by his close study of the antique Greek and Roman marbles in the Vatican, and he also had an intimate knowledge of high Renaissance painting of the early 16th century. His study of Michelangelo is revealed in Saint Sebastian, circa 1617, carved for Maffeo Cardinal Barberini, who was later Pope Urban VIII and Bernini's greatest patron. Bernini's earliest work was the attraction of Scopione Cardinal Borghese. A member of the reigning papal family under his patronage, Bernini carved his first important life-size sculptural groups. The series shows Bernini's progression from almost haphazard single view of Aeneas, Achises, and Ascanius fleeing Troy in 1619 to strong frontality in Pluto and Prosperina in 1621 to 22, and then the hallucinatory vision of Apollo and Daphne in 1622 to 24, which was intended to be viewed from one spot as if it were a relief. In his David of 1623 to 24, Bernini depicts the figure casting a stone at an unseen adversary. Several portrait busts that Bernini executed during his period, including that of Robert Cardinal Bellarmine, 1623 to 24, show a new awareness of the relationship between head and body and display an ability to depict fleeting facial expressions. With acute realism, these marbles shows an unparalleled virtuosity in carving that obdurate material to achieve the delicate effects usually found only in bronze sculptures. Bernini's sensual awareness of the surface texture of skin and hair and his novel sense of shading broke with the tradition of Michelangelo and marked the emergence of a new period in the history of Western sculpture. Now we move on to number 2, which is the patronage of Urban VIII. With the pontificate of Urban VIII in 1623 to 1644, Bernini entered a period of enormous productivity and artistic development. Urban VIII urged his protege to paint and to practice architecture. His first architectural work was remodeled Church Santa Bibiana in Rome. At the same time, Bernini was commissioned to build a symbolic structure over the tomb of St. Peter in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The result is the famous immense bronze baldachin executed between 1624 and 1633. Its twisted columns derive from the early Christian columns that had been used in the altar screen of Old St. Peter's. Bernini's most original contribution to the final work is the upper framework of the crowning volutes, flanked by 4 angels that support the orb and cross. The baldachin is perfectly proportioned to its setting, and one hardly realizes it is as tall as a 4-story building. Its lively outline moving upward to the triumphant crown, its dark color heightened with burning gold, give it a characteristic of a living organism. An unprecedented fusion of sculpture and architecture, the baldachin is the first truly Baroque monument. It ultimately formed the center of a pragmatic decoration designed by Bernini for the interior of St. Peter's. Bernini next supervised the decoration of four piers supporting the dome of St. Peter, with colossal statues, though only one of the latter, St. Longinus, was designed by him. He also made a series of portrait busts of Urban VIII, but the first bust to achieve the quality of his earlier portraits is that of his great patron Scipione Cardinal Borghese in 1632. The cardinal is shown in the act of speaking and moving, and the action is caught at a moment that seems to reveal all the characteristic qualities of the subject. Bernini's architectural duties increased after the death of Carlo Modeno in 1629. Over here, we can see St. Longinus on the left and the portrait of bust of Pope Urban VIII. As we continue on, Bernini's architectural duties increased after the death of Carlo Moderno in 1629, when Bernini became architect of St. Peter's and of the Palazzo Barberini. By this time, he was not only executing works himself, but also having to rely on assistance from others as the number of commissions grew. He was successful in organizing his studio and planning his work so that sculptures and ornamentations produced by a team actually seemed to be all of one piece. Bernini's work, then and always, was always shaped by the fervent Roman Catholicism. He attended Mass every day and took communion twice a week. He would agree with the formulations of the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563 that the purpose of religious art was to teach and inspire the faithful and to serve as propaganda for the Roman Catholic Church. Religious art should always be intelligible and realistic, and above all, it should serve as an emotional stimulus to piety. The development of Bernini's religious art was largely determined by his conscientious efforts to conform to those principles. Under Urban VIII, Bernini began to produce new and different kinds of monuments, tombs, and fountains. Here we can see the tomb of Pope Urban VIII on the left from 1628 to 47. And here we can see one of the fountains that he made, the fountains that he made in Rome, the Triton fountain in the Piazza Barberini from 1642 to 43, and one of the works that he did for the Maria Raggi in 1643. Bernini's early architectural projects, however, were not invariably successful. In 1637, he began to erect campaniles or bell towers above the facade of St. Peter's. But in 1646, when their weight began to crack the building, they were pulled down and Bernini was temporarily disgraced. So it wasn't that big of a success all the time for him. He had his setbacks. And now we move on to part 3, the patronage of Pope Innocent X and Alexander VIII. Bernini's most spectacular public monuments date from the mid-1640s to the 1660s. The Fountain of the Four Rivers in Rome's Piazza Navona from 1648 to 51 supports an ancient Egyptian obelisk over a hollowed-out rock, surmounted by 4 marble figures symbolizing 4 major rivers of the world. This fountain is one of his most spectacular works. The greatest single example of Bernini's mature art is of the Carnaro Chapel in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, which completes the evolution begun early in his career. The chapel, commissioned by Federigo Cardinal Cornaro, is in a shallow transept in a small church. Its point is its sculpture of the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, 1645 to 52, a depiction of a mystical experience of the great Spanish Carmelite reformer Teresa of Avila in representing Teresa's vision, during which an angel pierced her heart with a fiery arrow of divine love. Bernini followed Teresa's own description of the event, the sculptured group showing the transported saint swooning in the void, covered by cascading drapery, is revealed in celestial light within a niche over the altar, where the architectural and decorative elements are richly joined and articulated. At left and right, in spaces resembling opera boxes, numerous members of the Coronaro family are found in spirited postures of conversation, reading, or prayer. The Coronaro Chapel carries Bernini's ideal of a three-dimensional picture to its apex. The figures of Saint Teresa and the angel are sculptured in a white marble, but the viewer cannot tell whether they are in a round or merely in a high relief. The natural daylight that falls on the figures from the hidden source above and behind them is part of the group, as are the gilt rays behind. The ecstasy of Saint Teresa is not a sculpture in the conventional sense. Instead, it is a framed pictorial scene made up of sculpture, painting, and light that also includes the worshipper in a religious drama. In his later years, the growing desire to control the environments of his statuary led to Bernini to concentrate more and more on architecture. Of the churches he designed after completing the Coronaro Chapel, the most impressive is that of Santa Andrea al Quirinale in 1658-70 in Rome, with dramatic high altar soaring dome and an unconventionally seated oval plan. But Bernini's greatest architectural achievement is the colonnade enclosing the piazza before St. Peter's Basilica. The chief function of the large space was to hold the crowd that gathered for a papal benediction on Easter and other special occasions. Bernini planned a huge oval attached to the church by a trapezoidal forecourt forms that he compared to the encircling arms of the mother church. The freestanding colonnades were a novel solution to the need for a penetrable enclosure. The piazza guides the visitors towards the church and counterbalances the overly wide facade of St. Peter's. Bernini's oval encloses a space centered on the Vatican obelisk, which had been moved before the church of Sixtus V. No, no, before the church by Pope Sixtus V in 1586. Bernini moved an older fountain by Moderno into a long axis of the piazza and built a twin on the other side to make a scenographic whole. The analogies of to Bernini's oval plan of St. Andrea al Quirinale are fascinating, as are the differences in meaning and function. Bernini's most spectacular religious decoration is of the throne of St. Peter's on the Cathedra Petri. The Cathedra Petri in 1657 to 1666. A gilt bronze cover. Oh, this one is the one. Yes. Bernini most spectacular religious decoration is the throne of Saint Peter of the Cathedra Petri in 1657, a gilt bronze cover for the medieval wooden throne of the Pope. Bernini's task was not only to make a decorative cover for the chair, but also to create a meaningful goal for the apse of Saint Peter for the pilgrim's journey through the great church. The seat is seemingly supported by four imposing bronze figures representing theological doctors of the early church: Saints Ambrose, Athanasius, John Chrysostom, and Augustine, above a golden glory of angels on clouds and rays in light emanates from the dove of the Holy Spirit, which is painted on the oval window. The cathedra is produced about the same time as the piazza, and the contrast between these two works shows Bernini's versatility. Both works were done for the Chigi Pope. The Chigi Pope, Alexander VIII, who was one of the Bernini's greatest patrons. The tomb in 1671 and 78 that Bernini designed for Alexander VIII was largely executed by his pupils. In addition to his larger works, Bernini continued to produce a few portrait busts. The first one is for Francisco I d'Este, Duke of Modena, and culminates the revolution of portraiture. Much of the freedom or spontaneity of the bust of Cardinal Borghese is kept, but it is united with the heroic pomp and grandiose movement that portray the ideals of a Baroque age as much as the man. Now, at part 4, he goes for a trip to France. Bernini went to Paris in 1665, in what was his only prolonged absence from Rome. The trip was made in response to invitations that for many years had been extended to him by King Louis, and the purpose was to design a new French royal residence. By this time, Bernini was so famous that crowds lined up the streets of each city along the route to watch him pass. His initial reception in Paris was equally triumphant, but he soon offended his sensitive hosts by imperiously uh, praising the art and the architecture of Italy at the expense of that of France. His statements made him unpopular at the French court and were to some degree responsible for the rejection of his designs for the Louvre. The only relic in Bernini's visit to France is his great bust of King Louis, a linear, vertical, and stable portrait in which the Sun King gazes out with godlike authority. The image set a standard for royal portraits that lasted 100 years. And finally, part 5. Later and final years. Bernini's late works in sculpture are inevitably overshadowed by his grandiose projects for St. Peter's, but a few of them are of outstanding interest. For the Chigi Chapel and the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, he carved two groups: Daniel in the lion's den and Habakkuk and the angel. These works show the beginnings of his late style: elongation of the body, expressive gesture, and simplified yet emphatic emotional expressions. The same characteristics are already found in the figures supporting the throne of St. Peter and culminate in the moving angels for the St. Angelo's Bridge in Rome, which Bernini redecorated with the help of assistants between 1667 and 1671. Pope Clement of 1667 to 69 so prized the angels carved by Bernini that they were never set up on the bridge and are now in the church of St. Andrea della Frete in Rome. The redecorated St. Angelo Bridge leading across the Tiber forms an introduction to the Vatican, and Bernini's other works, the Piazza Scala Regia and the Baldacchine and the Cathedra within St. Peter's, forms a progressively more powerful expression of papal power to support and inspire Roman Catholic pilgrims to the site. Bernini completed one of the decorations to St. Peter's in his last years, the altar of the Santissimo Sacramento Chapel in 1673 to 74. Later and final years, Bernini completed one more decoration in St. Peter's in his last years, the altar of Santissimo Sacramento Chapel in 1673 to 74, and Bernini's greatest late work is the simple Altieri Chapel in San Francesco e Ripa in circa 1674 in Rome. Relatively deep space above the altar reveals a statue representing the death of the blessed Ludovica Albertoni. Bernini consciously separated architecture, sculpture, and painting for different roles, reversing the process that culminated in the Cornaro Chapel. In that sense, the Altieri Chapel is more traditional, a variation of his church interiors of the preceding years. Instead of filling the arched openings, the sculpted figures of Ludovica lies in the bottom of a large volume of space and is illuminated by a heavenly light that plays on the drapery gathered over her recumbent figure. her hands weakly clutching her breasts make explicit her painful death. Bernini died at the age of 81 after having served 8 popes, and when he died, he was widely considered not only Europe's greatest artists, but also one of the greatest men of Europe. He was the last of Italy's remarkable series of universal geniuses, and the Baroque style he helped create was the last Italian style to become an international standard. His death marked the end of Italy's artistic hegemony in Europe. The style he evolved was carried on for 2 more generations in various parts of Europe by the architects Mattia de' Rossi and Carlo Fontana in Rome, J.B. Fischer von Erlach in Austria, and the brothers Cosmos and Egid Quirin Assam in Bavaria, among others. Thank you for watching my presentation on Gian Lorenzo Bernini.